everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Audio Tools Explained. Glad to have you guys here today. Today we're going to be doing our first installation of compression, how compressors work, how to use them, what their functions are, and how to adjust them. This is probably going to be a 2 or 3 video series on compression, just because compression is one of the more advanced kind of tools that you can use when you're working with your audio for your film, or if you're working with music for mixing. There are a lot of small intricacies that you need to be aware of, and you really need to have your head kind of wrapped around the whole concept to really understand what's happening with the audio and how to adjust it. So we're going to be going really into depth with this type of plugin and this effect, and we're going to learn all we can about it in 2 or 3 videos. As you can see, I have a couple compression plugins up on the screen here. The one on the right that you see is my stock compressor that comes with my DAW, which is Nuendo. This is just a stock Steinberg Nuendo compressor. The one on the left here that you see is the FabFilter Pro C2, which is a compressor that was released by a plugin company called FabFilter. They make a lot of mixing plugins that are really, really high-end quality, in my personal opinion. I know a lot of mixers out there that use them as well. They are really, really good plugins. And as you can see already, we have a little bit of a visual difference between the two. Before I start explaining how these work, I would like to point out that the compressor on the left, the Pro C2, it does have a sort of visual display of how it's altering the audio that is a bit more detailed than the compressor on the right. So I'm going to do my best to keep both of these on the screen so that you can see how these compressors are affecting the audio as it happens. We're going to hop into the settings today, and we're going to hop into the basics of what a compressor does. Next video will probably go into different types of compression. The basics of what a compressor does is it compresses your audio, but there is a bit more to it than that. So audio in your electronic software program, such as Nuendo, or if you're using a compressor on your film, maybe you're using Premiere Pro or After Effects or some other video editing software such as Final Cut. If you have audio in a program like that, the audio will be measured in a unit of volume called a decibel. When you're working with audio in an electronic medium, decibel on your electronic medium will be different than a decibel in your natural real world. In the real world, decibels a measure of how loud a sound is. In electronic world, a decibel is a rating of the strength of the electrical voltage that is being used to transfer this sound. So what a compressor does is it takes that electrical signal, and what it does is if there is a spike in it, it will take that spike and it'll crush it down a little bit. In the digital world, it works the same way, except it's bits and bytes, right? It's not an analog voltage that it's compressing, it's bits and bytes. It's really complicated. All you really need to know and understand about a compressor is that it will be taking the really loud noises in your audio, and will be making them quieter, and will be making the really quieter sounds in your audio and making them louder. In a compressor, there are a couple settings that you need to be aware of. We'll start with this stock compressor here and kind of explain some of the more basic functions that a compressor has. This compressor here has an input view and an output view of how loud your audio is. This is up in this strum guitar here, which I'll just play here. And as I'll play it, you'll see that the input volume and the output volume will be displayed. So you can see both of them are about the same volume because the compressor is not actually doing anything right now. So it has that sort of visual display. The Pro C2 also contains a similar display, except the input volume is visually represented in the middle here, and the output volume is measured on these bars on the right. So if I just enable that, so a bit of a different visual display, but it is basically the same information, if not the exact same information. So as we're going through this display here, you may see that this visual display on this little box right here of our compressor, you might see these angles change, and I'll explain how all this is affecting the audio as we're going through it. So to start, we have the very basics of the compressor, which is the ratio and the attack. And you also have a threshold setting, which is over here. The release is also very, very important. Those four functions will make up almost any compressor you can find, unless it's a compressor that is only set to have a certain length of attack and a certain length of release or a certain ratio. 99% of the time, unless it's this really weird compressor, you will always have threshold control, because threshold control is something you absolutely need to have the compressor to work. So to start out, we're just going to explore what the ratio knob does. So you can see here they have these ratios. On this stock compressor, it's a ratio of 2:1 until I start adjusting it. On the Pro C2, it starts at a ratio of 4:1. Remember how I mentioned how it will be making the loud sounds quieter? So basically, what happens is when audio is put in through your compressor, it will pass a threshold. The threshold on compressors is set by the threshold setting. On the Pro C2, it's currently set to -18. On the compressor for the stock, it is currently set at about -20. So if you have audio that is louder than that, it is going to let 1 decibel through for every however many decibels your ratio is set at. So if I have a signal that is 22 decibels loud and I run it through the Pro C2 with a threshold of 18, that means I have 4 decibels louder than what the threshold is allowing. So if I have the ratio set to 4:1, my end audio signal will actually be coming out at 19 decibels, because it's only letting 1 decibel through past that threshold of the 4 that actually are above it. So what this does is it crushes that audio down. Now, this doesn't necessarily make the quiet sounds louder. However, it reduces your dynamic range of the audio. And in that sense, instead of having a dynamic range this big, where your quietest sound is down here and your loudest sound's up here, now it's this big, and your quietest sound is louder and your loudest sound is quieter. Of course, you can adjust these functions. You can adjust the threshold down or up so that the louder audio might not be compressed as much, or if the threshold's all the way down, it'll be compressed more. Same with the ratio. As you can see over here, you can adjust the ratio on this compressor, and you can see that as I'm adjusting the ratio, it actually makes this slant either steeper or shallower, depending on how big the ratio is. Now, a bigger ratio will increase the amount of compression that is done once the audio passes the threshold point. So it is very, very important to understand how that is affecting your audio, because sometimes you might not want it compressed as much. Very, very compressed audio tends to distort a little bit or have artifacts, and this can sometimes damage your end audio output, which is very, very bad in any sort of situation. Now, the other 2 functions you have on this are attack and release. Of course, as you can see on the Pro C2 over here, it also has a knee, a range, a look ahead, and a hold, and these dry wet knobs. Over here on the stock compressor, we have attack, hold, release, analysis, and the dry mix. So, of course, features like the dry mix and the wet gain and all that, and the dry gain are just your basic wet to dry functions. Normally on compressors, just leave it at 100%. So basically, what the attack and release functions do is they determine how fast the compression takes place after the threshold is hit, and how fast the compression stops after the audio goes back below that threshold. Because the compression isn't constant once it passes above the threshold, and then it's just compressing forever. What happens is if the audio signal passes the threshold, it will start compressing, and when it dips back below the threshold, it begins to stop compressing. It doesn't stop compressing right as it passes the threshold ever. It either starts to compress or stops to compress. It is never instant. It is never one of those things where it's just like, oh, we're done, we're going right now. An attack control is very, very useful for things like transient control and transient compression. If you want the beginning part of your audio to be a bit louder, it's a very, very important setting for doing things like drum compression. If you want to snap your snare or more poppy audio, you'll generally set your attack to somewhere between 5 to 10 milliseconds, because transients are really, really fast, really insanely fast. The transient of your audio will usually happen within the first 3 to 4 milliseconds of your audio. The release is also very important for doing things like body control. If you want the frequencies more balanced out, having the release set at the proper time will be useful for that. It's good for controlling the tail of your audio. Now, of course, we have other features here like the knee and the range. I don't see a knee option on our stock compressor on the right, but basically what a knee does is you see how there's this sharp angle here where if this is the threshold and this is the compression, because that's what this dot represents as the threshold. As you can see, if I move it up or down, it's moving that up or down. What a knee does is it will actually determine a wider area of where the compression starts based off of the threshold. If you have a very, very soft knee is what we call it when you have a knee of like 18 or whatever, the compression will actually start before it meets the threshold, but it will be softer. So if I have a ratio of 100-1, which is insane compression, and I have a knee of, say, 18 decibels, and let's just say a threshold of around 20, the compression will actually start 18 decibels before it hits the threshold of minus 20. So it'll start around minus 38. But it will be a very, very much softer compression. Instead of 100-1, it'll be somewhere around maybe 2-1 or 5-1 or 10-1. And as the audio gets louder and louder and approaches that threshold, the curve will just increasingly get steeper and it will compress more. Functions like range and look ahead and hold, we will explore later on. We're going to kind of learn some of the basics now of how this compressor will work and how it's affecting our audio. So I'm just going to disable the Pro C2 and we're going to go through with the stock compressor. Now I have this up on a strum guitar. You heard it earlier. It sounds like this. Here's what happens when I put it through a compressor. As you can see, it has a gain reduction thing here. That's what the GR stands for, is gain reduction. If you see gain reduction, that means your compressor is working. And it's reducing the volume of your signal by however many decibels are stated on the gain reduction thing. As you can see, it says it's reducing it by minus 6.4 on average. You can also see it has a visual display that comes down. So as I adjust this threshold, you're going to see more and more gain reduction, and you're also going to see the output audio go down in response to the input signal. Now you can't really see it looking at the numbers, but if you look at the 2 meters here, you will see that the meter on the left, the input, is louder than the meter on the right by about 6 to 8 dB on average, even though it says it's doing gain reduction of minus 34.3. Now, there is such a thing as makeup gain, which this is currently set to auto-enable. What this does is if there is auto-enabled makeup gain, it will automatically try and make the output signal as loud as the input signal so that you can hear the difference in compression. If I turn this off of auto, you will hear immediately that the output signal is much quieter than the input signal. And you can see it much more clearly on the display here. You can barely hear it. And as I turn the threshold up, it's going to compress less and less, until it's not compressing at all. So the threshold will control where the compression starts and generally how much compression is done, because if you have your threshold set lower, there's more decibels above the threshold, and thus, and by transitive property, there are less decibels coming out. Now we're going to leave this around here so we get a basic amount of compression happening, just a small amount there. And I'm going to play around with the ratio a little bit. So if I have a ratio of 1-1, just a heads up, never use a ratio of 1-1, because what this will happen is no compression at all, no compression. For every 1 decibel that goes through, 1 decibel is being let through. So no compression is happening until you go above 1-1. However, good compression settings are generally between 2:1 to 3:1 to 4:1. And as soon as you start getting to compression ratios of 10:1 or more, you're generally doing something called limiting, which is another type of compression, which we will explore in another video. If you're just looking to compress your audio a little bit, don't go above 10:1 generally, unless you're planning on limiting, which we will explain at a different point. What this does basically, as I mentioned, is it controls the ratio of how many decibels above the threshold to how many decibels are actually let through. If I have it set to around 2:1, for every 2 decibels above the threshold, it will only let 1 through. And if I push it up to 8:1, it will only let 1 decibel through for every 8 decibels through. It is a little bit hard to understand, and you may need to do some research outside of this video. Visual representation of compression is really the easiest way to learn it. For that, I will pull up the Pro C2 momentarily to explain. I'm going to set this ratio to about 8:1. I'm just going to disable this compressor, enable this one, and you can see what I mean when I say 8:1, whatever. And I'll put the needle super hard so that we can just get this accurate. So this even has a little visual display here of where the audio is going in terms of threshold. This little line here represents where the threshold is set. As you can see, the audio is going much, much farther than where that line is. And as you can see here, this red line is our gain reduction, and it's doing about 9 decibels of gain reduction at its max. If I decrease this ratio, you will see less gain reduction, until I'm doing none at all at 1:1. However, if I'm at something like 2:1, it's doing about 3 decibels. If I go up to 4 to 5:1, it's doing around 6. And if I go up around 8 or 9:1, it's capping out at 9, somewhere between 7 and 8 though, realistically. And you can see this line here, this white line, and as you can see, these white lines here represent the incoming audio, and this represents the gain reduction that's going against it. So it's actually crushing that audio down, pushing it down out of the way so that it's more of a brick and less of a, I don't know what you'd call it, just naturally sounding audio. Now, I'm going to try and cut this video a little short here, just because if I go any further, we'll be starting to explore different types of compression, which I don't want to do yet. I want to save that for our next compression video. So if you have any questions about how compressors work, ask me below in the comments. I'll be more than happy to respond if I see a question. I may not see it, keep that in mind, but I'll do my best to answer it. I recommend researching these functions outside of this video, just because it is a hard concept to wrap your head around, especially if you're just getting into working with audio. It took me probably 3 or 4 months from starting to learn about compression to fully understand what it does and how it works, because I had amazing teachers. I wouldn't call myself the best teacher, but I'm hoping that this video series helps everyone out. Next week, we will be releasing a composition redo, and then after that, another compression video. So I hope you guys found this informative. Play around with the settings, use your ears, figure out what it's doing to your audio. Leave the makeup gain off so that you can really hear kind of how much it's reducing. And if you want to hear how it's affecting your audio, turn the makeup gain on to automatic, and you can switch the plugin on and off, and you can hear the differences in how it's affecting your audio. That is one thing I always recommend for using compressors, is just toggle between bypass and unbypass with the makeup gain set at auto, so that you can really hear what it's doing to your audio signal. So I'm going to leave it here. I hope you guys found this informative, and I hope you are sticking around for our next composition redo and our next composition review. It's going to be a surprise, I think, because even I don't know what I'm doing yet. So I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one, and enjoy the rest of your day. See you next week.